I appreciate it.
Mhm.
And I appreciated being able to, having done many lectures on the history of home economics, history of family and consumer sciences, I was thrilled to read a book that brought all of it together in one place in a very readable manner. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
I would kind of like to start talking about, the thesis of your book and how home economics, so many people have the wrong impression or the wrong view of what home economics is and who were and are home economists.
Right, right. So, people think that home economists were, stuffy ladies or men, maybe with, aprons on making brownies, and that the point of the field was to keep women barefoot and pregnant. And that was not the case at all. It was so home economics began in the late 19th century as a movement that was trying to do two things. One is they were trying to bring science into the home so that people, women and sometimes people of color could take care of their homes more quickly, more efficiently, more healthfully, focus on the things that actually mattered, and then let the rest go so that they could have more time to do things that were not taking care of the house, whether that be studying or paid employment or taking care of their children or participating in civic life. All of those things they thought were more meaningful than cleaning your house. And the other thing they did was they turned the home into a range of careers that women would be accepted in because they were tied back to what work that had been done in the home that was, considered women's sphere. So that could be things like hotel management or dietetics or early childhood education or science. So women could not get were not allowed to join chemistry labs for the most part. But if you were doing the chemistry of meat in a home economics lab, you were still doing the same chemistry, but it seemed appropriately feminine. And they really succeeded. They built just a whole field of their own, which included, entire university departments, in some cases with, college status, that were almost entirely female. And they succeed. So yeah, they succeeded. And it was not until much later that the forces of repression, which to be fair, were always sort of at war with the forces of liberation in home economics, took over and began to push their achievements aside.
Well, I've kind of always seen it as it was feminism for those that saw themselves as feminists, as well as those who didn't see themselves as feminists. It was a place to land for women that had fewer opportunities. And I think, there were several rock stars that you mentioned within your book. What were some of your favorites?
Oh gosh. So they really were, the founders were all really extraordinary. And I agree that it was this fascinating way to be feminist while working within the system.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, it was one of the reasons that I found the topic appealing in the first place. Was even today, I feel like it's a fascinating way to talk about feminism to people across the political spectrum, because of the stereotypes that people hold about it being a traditionalist field. So some of the rock stars, well, the famous Ellen Swallow Richards was a truly extraordinary person. So she was not in fact the only founder of home economics, but she is, usually gets the honor of that. And she was, when I first started doing, I came up with this idea, and I was thinking, been an education reporter for a few years, and I thought, home economics, shouldn't that be back by now? Like, there's so much going on in our culture that speaks to why, home economics concerns like adulting and HGTV and career and technical education and, pushback against tests. But I had no idea until I started doing the research that Ellen Swallow Richards was the first woman to attend MIT back in the early 1870s. And I mean, MIT didn't take women. She was a chemist. She had gone to Vassar, which was brand new. And she went in her mid-20s because it took that long for a college that accepted women to open up near her. But she applied anyway because she just wanted more education. And I mean, she accomplished an extraordinary range of things. She was she was concerned with public health.
Mm-hmm.
So she tested water for purity. She did work for an insurance company testing testing wallpaper for things like arsenic. And Boston school superintendent looked at her working one day because she was doing all of this work for women teachers, women who wanted to study science. And he said, "What good do you think this will do women in the kitchen?" And he meant this as, just a sneer. But she was like, well, geez, well, this is a great question. What good will this do women in the kitchen? Women need to be empowered. Women need to embrace science. And she saw also that with the Industrial Revolution was transforming the world, but it had not yet permeated, consciously speaking, into the home. I mean, it already was making a difference in terms of bringing technology into the home. That, I mean, we don't think about this today, but it used to be, to do anything involving heat in your home, you had to make a fire, like in your stove, right? Like you had to get coal or wood and keep a fire going in your stove. And that stove didn't have a thermostat. Like you couldn't just turn on the stove and cook something. And also at the same time, you had women who had worked in service as maids. There were enslaved women who are now free. There were immigrants who were taking jobs in textile factories because even that hard work had more self-respect and more dignity and better working conditions than working in somebody's home. So she saw that, with that plus the economic revolution, they had taken out of the home everything that was interesting and economically productive and just left only this repetitive labor. And in fact, I was just looking up some of her writings today, and she was saying that she said, like, the endless drudgery of dishwashing, which is never done. And like, man, isn't it, right? Like 100+ years ago, 120 years ago, she wrote this. It's like, that has not changed.
I think Ellen is one of the people I look towards. I also, Catherine Beecher, I don't think always gets the acclaim in our home economic circles that she probably deserves. But probably the unspoken heroes maybe are Catherine and Ellen's parents, who said, our daughters are going to be well educated and we want the best for our daughters. What are we going to do to promote their well-being, their mental health, to knowing that to have a great mental health, they need to be doing great things. Yeah. And I think about them a lot of times thinking, oh, how many friends did they have that were laughing behind their backs of, why are you doing this? And what's the point of them going to school in the first place?
Right. Well, then let's add Margaret Murray Washington's mother to the list of like amazing, empowering parents. So one of the most important people, I think the most important person I learned about in this writing, who I'd never heard of, like the most famous woman to be totally forgotten. She died in 1925. This is Margaret Murray Washington, died in 1925. The president sent a telegram. I mean, she was one of the most famous Black women in America. She was, among other things, Booker T. Washington's third wife, and she ran home economics at Tuskegee for about it was more like 35 years. And she had a really fascinating message of empowerment for Southern Black women who were, one generation out of slavery. But she herself, I mean, she was born in Mississippi to a woman who was a woman who did laundry, and an Irish railroad man. And it was right at the end of the Civil War. And there was no public schools in her town, let alone a public school that was going to allow African-American students. But she must have just been such an obviously smart girl. And there a Quaker, a pair of siblings, white siblings who had come down to the South to educate freed people, took her under their wing and taught her, and then arranged for her to go off to Nashville so that she could study at Fisk College. But, this entailed also doing high school there, because it's not as if there was any high schools for Black people in, the middle of nowhere in Mississippi. So yeah, her mother, recognized this, gave her the time to learn, allowed her child to go off. I mean, this wasn't like hopping on the Delta shuttle or something to go to Nashville in those days. And she earned a bachelor's degree. She met the Queen of England. She led this extraordinary life, lecturing and teaching and doing all sorts of community activism.
I think that's one of the biggest things new things I gained from reading your book was about Margaret Washington. And when I saw some of your early editions of your book, I immediately added it to my lecture about the history of family and consumer sciences, because we don't know this. Maybe I don't know this. I will not say I didn't know that. And I think that's a great example. The other thing I thought was really cool was that she was in college with W.E.B. Du Bois.
Yes.
So here's a woman who is surrounded by the big thinkers of the day, both African American, kind of opposite sides of the philosophical spectrum. And I just thought, oh my goodness, what opportunity for her. And it seems like she bridged the two philosophies pretty well.
Yeah, I think so. And for, you guys who are not familiar with this debate, so Du Bois and Washington were the opposite poles of, Booker T. Washington is considered the more conservative, accommodationist thinker in Black activism and civil rights and education, and Du Bois was more what we would call today progressive. In the education realm, they had an argument that, continues to this day, which is like, is the purpose of college and education to become this cultured citizen, like that liberal arts model, or is it to get a job? And so Du Bois was not a fan of what was then called manual training, industrial education, vocational education, because he was saying, a Black person should have the same education as these elite white guys going to Harvard. And for that matter, a bunch of the Seven Sisters women's colleges felt the exact same way about home economics. So we're not having our girls study housekeeping. But then Booker T and Margaret Washington both thought that there, had a whole bunch of arguments on the other side. They said, there's dignity in all work. These are the jobs that are the vast majority of people are going to get. These are skills that are important to your life, no matter what you do for work. And it was a really fascinating debate to read, especially because we just, as I said, we just still deal with all of these questions today.
Mm-hmm. We do, and even the concept of what careers are most prestigious. Mm-hmm. And I deal with this at the university level. Even what majors are more prestigious typically has to do with ones that produce a product for sale, as opposed to a major that is person-centered, no matter what it is.
Well, and let us not forget, and this is something that I put towards it in the end of the book. I mean, the professions that have traditionally been women's professions pay badly, like welding, plumbing, the trades, right? Like they pay really, really well. Early childhood education pays nothing. So it's just what we value salary wise. And certainly, we don't value, economically speaking, we quite literally don't value the work of taking care of a household and taking care of children unless you're paying somebody else to do it, in which case it's somehow simultaneously extraordinarily expensive for the person who's paying and extraordinarily underpaid for the person who's doing the work.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, the thought that home economics is so gendered. Mm-hmm. So we have that baggage. It's very gendered. And then if you think about being a home economics teacher or a family consumer science teacher, then that's gendered squared. If you're a
Absolutely,
teacher,
yeah.
plus you're teaching a gendered content area. So I think that's one of those things that, is such a societal, systemic societal issue. And speaking of systemic societal issues, I've told my students that, in our conversation, we talk about the good, the bad, the ugly, and the wonderful of family and consumer sciences. And part of that would be the racial injustice that our profession contributed to, despite the fact that a lot of these people were so in tune to justice, but they weren't seeing bigger picture or were not addressing the current racial problems of the time.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and the home economics, like every other part of American history, was both people of color were central to and excluded from the field. So home economics in a university level actually started at Black colleges. It started at Hampton, which is where Booker T. Washington was educated. And that was actually a year or two before the Midwestern, then Western, land grant universities began teaching home economics as well. And it was, talk about, something being low status when you're talking. There's the other reason for the sharpness of the debate between Du Bois and Washington. When you're talking about, you said home economics teaching is gender squared. Black woman teaching home economics is like gender, intersectionality, to use our current term, right? Like cubed. And they were always crucial, but the field remained segregated until the mid 1960s. And I went through like the Journal of Home Economics and the American Home Economics Association bulletins and conferences. And there were a few Black women in the field very early, who were members of the Home Economics Association very early on, but the Southern chapters were segregated, and the national organization let them stay that way and did not provide a way to become a member outside of your state organization until during World War II, and it was a big fight. And even beyond that, when I read, there were certainly plenty and things. It's all over, right? Like you have the Extension Service, which is community education for adults, which also does youth too, like 4-H is part of Extension. And they had these separate and terribly unequal systems all across the South for the African-American extension agents and the white extension agents. And then reading through all of these records, some people were just out and out racist, and the field as a whole, the white field, was preaching these WASP values and things to eat and saying this way of life is the best, and looking down on people who, because of oppression, had been given, like Native Americans, pushed to the worst land in the middle of nowhere, and then looking down on them and saying, oh, they're not civilized, they're not leading civilized lives, when they had everything taken away from them. So this is all all through. And the biggest, I think, shocker to, I went looking for a lot of this because I knew it was going to be there. I went looking for,
because it's part of our history as the people of American citizens.
Yeah. But I will say I was a little, the biggest like shock, I'm not unsurprising yet still shocking moment of my research on this was wondering, so the home economics sort of classically is said to have begun as a field in 1899 at the Lake Placid conference in Lake Placid, New York, which is when the first book about home economics was written in 1841. But this is when a group of about a dozen people, white people, got together to like codify the field and to state that they wanted to create like a profession. I'm forgetting the verb, I'm gonna have to paraphrase. A profession commanding adequate compensation. And I was, I sat there and I scratched my head for a while and I was like, so it's all white. Was it just like they were, not white people had more power and were just ignoring African Americans? And the answer is no. This was at the resort owned by Melville Dewey and his wife, Dewey of the Dewey Decimal System. And it was an exclusionary resort. He would not have African Americans and he would not have Jews. And he made all sorts of, excuses about how like their Southern clientele wouldn't be okay with it. And he actually really did say in something that's written down that some of his best friends were Jews. And this all came out because he was booted from his job as state librarian of New York and mostly because he excluded Jews. But also because he excluded African Americans. So yes, this central conference in the development of the field was at an all white resort.
Mm-hmm. So I think it's important for us to grapple with that, and also with the concept that if people aren't aware, even currently today, for secondary family and consumer sciences programs, there is a youth component or a career technical youth organization called FCCLA, Future Community Career Leaders of America, FCCLA. And there was at one point an African American group, the national.
The New Homemakers of it was
New Homemakers
this group.
Of
Some of you will have know as the Future Homemakers of America, right? And the African American equivalent was the New Homemakers of America.
And they had some. I was thinking part of their pledge was to promote justice in the nation and peace in the world. And I thought, oh, I hate that we lost that. When they came together, they were kind of like subsumed by FCCLA, which I'm a huge proponent of FCCLA today. And there's some great videos on the membership page of FCCLA of this group, this African American group. So someone may want to check that out. But I thought, oh, it would have been great for there to have been a sit down and let's look at our motto and our pledges and how can we combine them rather than.
Right. Let's take the best of both.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. But unfortunately that didn't happen, but as
it still could. Forward, they could go back. They could go back and I am really FCCLA. Does really great work. The I have some reporting from their conference in my book. It was the last piece of out in the world reporting I did before the pandemic lockdowns began. And they, these kids do these amazing like service learning projects, and it's all like very community oriented. But and the management is, like they're perfectly nice and they're very busy, but they were not like they did not seem terribly pleased that I was like nagging them about why there was no mention of the New Homemakers of America on their website.
Well, it's on there now. So maybe, so perhaps,
I hadn't seen that.
Yeah. So
That's
you want to check that out. Self-disclosure, I'm on the board of FCCLA, had nothing to do with that, but they, like with all of us, sometimes you don't know what you don't know.
Right.
And then we can do better after we learn better. Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes. So, throughout the years, home economics has, had this great body of work that has been recognized. And one thing that I noted from your book was during wartime, there was such a great demand for home economists and the great things they did. And it seemed like the powers that be understood that they had great things to offer.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so World War I is when home economics really emerged into national prominence. And I mean, Herbert Hoover, who was the head of the US Food Administration, literally sent a telegram to Cornell University, to the home economics department, to its co-director, Flora Rose, and said, can you come to Washington? We need you now. Mm-hmm. And so this is something I certainly hadn't had a very good idea of. World War I, there was no rationing, but there was a lot of call for voluntary, what's the word I'm looking for? Restrictions, so that
Yes.
you could send food, send materials to the troops and to the refugees who were coming to their side of the war lines. And so when there's no, especially when there's no, they had to persuade people to eat less sugar, to eat less wheat. I mean, who wants that? And they brought on, so the government funded home economists to, work centrally in DC with the US Food Administration to come up with a whole lot of recipes for, delicious food that used less wheat, less sugar.
And that were nutritious.
Yeah,
Because
and
we'd
nutritious.
already said that was, a premise of who we are, was this is about nutrition. This isn't just about looking pretty food.
Right. Despite a whole lot of, stereotypes about Jell-O
Yes.
salads.
Right.
And they, in fact, in this work, home economists did a lot of the foundational work on vegetarian cooking, because they did not invent the calorie, which, but they promoted the calorie, which I suppose, is good and bad. And they created and publicized nutritional analyses of all these different foods, with this idea that you could then put together these balanced, nourishing meals. And they did the work on, how much of each nutrient people needed, though that was more towards World War II, that you could, so that people, in this case in wartime, but who were deprivation, who didn't have much money, you didn't have to eat meat, you could eat legumes, and here's all these different ways to prepare them that would be delicious. And also this served to promote the farming industry as well, because there's a whole part of home economics that has always been part of the US Department of Agriculture. So if the farmers had produced a whole lot of black-eyed peas, they would call upon home economists to create recipes using black-eyed peas, which also later turned into a whole line of business jobs for corporations that were producing a whole lot of a product, and home economists would create recipes on how to cook with that product so that they could sell it. So, but going back to the wartime, they had community educators helping people can and preserve, and they did this all through both World War I, the Depression, and World War II. Home economists were at the forefront. I mean, they created new weaving designs of knitting and weaving for cotton stockings during World War II, because silk was needed for the war effort and cotton stockings had to replace, and they weren't as good. And I guess one thing I want to make sure that I mention here is, up until through World War II, I mean, it was about empowering women, but at the same time, like, there wasn't anything terribly gendered in anything that I read about, about from home from the home economists, about what people should do. Like, they knew that for the most part, it was women. I mean, almost always, right? It was women who were taking care of these things at home, but there wasn't anything like inherently gendered about the jobs or about the work. Like, they were not pushing like a woman's highest purpose is to, take care of her family or anything like that. It was like, these are jobs that need to be done, and here's a better way to do them.
And some and here's a better way to dress for those jobs, so that you can do the job safely and efficiently and with fewer textiles, because we need the textiles elsewhere. How can we make something as with little as possible?
Right. Like the World War II sewing patterns, which are amazing. The Bureau of Home Economics, which was founded in 1926, created these patterns, these designs that they then, for work clothes for women doing a range of war jobs, from working on the farm to working in factories, because no one had designed clothes for women to be working on an assembly line, even though women had been working on assembly lines for decades. But something that would be cute and comfortable and safe. They had belts that were fastened with snaps, so if it caught in the machinery, it would just come unsnapped instead of like pulling you into the machine.
So that whole war effort, I think, was really a wonderful way for all women. I think it gave them opportunities. And then of course, then we retrenched again as the whole nation did, in the 50s, and a little bit more of the, the traditional, whoever's tradition it is, role of women in the 50s.
Right.
Yeah. Well, so during this time, in fact, I believe Ellen Swallow Richards said, we can't produce only teachers. So we had women not only becoming home economics teachers in middle schools and high schools and at universities, we also had home economists in business, which you alluded to just a little bit ago about these opportunities for women as home economists that corporations realized were important.
Yeah. So, and that began mostly in the 1920s, which obviously a decade for the most part of prosperity. Agriculture was a bit of a mess, but for many people. And then there was new electricity was coming in, which required a really big, yet another piece of technology we don't think about, but a rethinking of how people did things around the home, and in new instructions, right? Like for how to, how to take care of electric appliances. And you also had radio. So you had this, mass communication mechanism opening up. And home economists pitched themselves as experts on the consumer. Personal finance had always been part of home economics because it was seen as the homemaker's role to control the spending for the household. So this was a customer who could be exploited, could be protected, could be educated. Home economists saw their job as simultaneously serving the company and the consumer by putting out good information and good products for the customer, and then bringing their feedback up to the company to help them create better products. But it was really, there were a lot of jobs. There were the most famous being Betty Crocker, who did not exist. Apparently no one ever said she didn't exist. It was clear that she had a team, but Betty, the company was supposed to never acknowledge that she, wasn't real. But there was a whole team of home economists working on Betty Crocker materials, from the radio script and later television scripts to the recipes to coming up with a curriculum for these cooking correspondence classes that she taught, to answering tons and tons and tons of phone calls and letters from customers asking about this, that, or the other. In fact, and this is many years later, this is actually so much later than we realized, 1982, the Butterball Turkey Hotline was also started as a home economics project as well.
Well, so if we think about family and consumer sciences teachers, which a lot of times in today's world, when we talk about FCS, we frequently are referring to the middle and high school teacher teaching family and consumer sciences, but they have to be prepared somewhere.
Right.
And, at one time, there was hundreds of places that you could go to become a family and consumer science teachers. And now we're down below 80 places in the whole US to become a family and consumer sciences teacher. One of the things, and this ended before I went through teacher preparation program, was this concept of a home management house, a place to practice. And tell us a little bit about what your findings were of the home management house.
Right. So the home management house was actually a really fun project.
It sounds like it's a cool place. Like I said, it ended before my time. But
it's sort of a life-size dollhouse. I've been describing it as a living lab, but maybe a life-size dollhouse is more appropriate. And it began, the very first one I have read about was at Atlanta University, which is a Black college in 1901, really early, but they really started taking off about maybe 10 years after that. And it was this live-in lab. So colleges and even occasionally high schools would have a house or an apartment that was meant, the idea was that seniors would come and live there for maybe a quarter, and they would it would sort of be like a sorority house. They would take care of all of the work to keep the home running. They would have a certain amount of money that they would have to budget. They'd have to come up with what chores were they going to do, who was going to do them. They would have to put on some events. And the most colorful part of this in the starting the 1920s was the practice baby, which is probably the thing in the book that like shocks people the most. So some people have, had a home economics parenting project where they had to carry a sack of flour around or an egg to try to simulate the experience of taking care of a child, which I think Paula here is listening can attest it, baby is not a sack of flour. But what they did before that was they actually had a baby, like an actual baby in the practice house. They would borrow the baby from an orphanage, usually, almost always it was an orphanage, and they would raise the baby in the practice house for maybe a year, an academic year, and they would just do everything for this baby, and this was a huge hit. Like the students loved it. They would put together scrapbooks to remember the babies by, because after they were adopted, obviously it's the era of closed adoption. So they would just go off into the world and nobody ever knew what became of them. They were very popular to adopt, supposedly because they were being raised in the most scientific manner, though that's what the newspaper said. In reality, it may well have been because parents knew perfectly well that they got a lot more attention than a kid who was, in an orphanage and with a lot of other children and very few staff. And one thing that I just think is fascinating is it's actually, I think, a sign of the way in which home economists were non-traditional about like gender roles and relationships, that in a way like that really goes against the stereotypes that people have of the field. Most of the early leading home economists were either not married or they didn't have children. Some were widowed. Black home economists tend more likely to be married because Black women have been more likely to work for pay anyway. But a lot of women remained single or made lives with other women because it was almost impossible to have a career and be married, or certainly to have children at that time. And so even though we look at practice babies and we sort of impose our like, oh, isn't that cute, they're getting ready to be mothers, when you really look at what they're learning, it was like 6 young women plus a college professor living in this house looking after a baby. And like the college professor was in charge when the students went off to class because their education came first. Like this has nothing to do with like a traditional heterosexual nuclear household, right? Like one of the scholars I read described it as like a sort of a feminist commune.
I found that very, very interesting. And, during that time period, Dr. Spock was so much about everything being regimented and, things being done a certain way. So I think when it went away, besides people thinking it seems icky a little bit, there's also that thought of it's not regimented. Not everybody has to do things exactly the same way and still raise a healthy child.
Right.
But a librarian at one of the universities I used to teach at called me, said, I have some great pictures for you. I said, what? And he said, it's of the home management house here on campus. And it was, the president would dine there, every so many weeks, and they'd learn about it. So
I will say nowadays, I mean, after the second wave of feminist revolution, home economics really turned very quickly and embraced different kinds of families and working women. I mean, it had always been about working women, and endorsed the Equal Rights Amendment. And it is today, like the academic track is remarkably accepting of people who have kids. I noticed like there's a really large number of family and consumer sciences professors who got their, who taught in middle or high schools for some number of years, were married, had children, later went back for their doctorate, became professors when they were 45 years old. Like that's a really normal. Yeah.
Yep, that's me. Yeah. And part of that, was the thought of I appreciated the content and felt empowered that I could do that.
Mm-hmm.
Or that a mentor said, you can do this.
Yeah.
So I think, that can have an impact there as well.
And let me just interject one note for people that, since we've been sort of throwing around the term family and consumer sciences. So what that is it is home economics, but the field rebranded in the early 90s because they were getting so little respect. And people, the esteemed position of, the world wars was long gone. And so after a number of years of trying to say home economics is not just stitching and stirring, the people who were leaders at the time decided to change the name to family and consumer sciences, which I argue is, a name that, well, I think it's inarguable that that name has not caught on across society.
Well, and even in places you think it should have caught on. I was doing a recruitment for family and consumer sciences teacher education at a very large high school in Indianapolis. And as two girls came by and was looking at my display, and I said, have you thought about being a family and consumer sciences teacher? And they said, no, what is that? This high school has 12 family and consumer science teachers.
Wow.
So when I then said, well, did you take nutrition and wellness? Oh yeah, I love that. Did you take child development? Oh yes, those are my favorite classes. I said, all of that is family and consumer sciences. Oh, so even in the realm of people who are daily interacting with family and consumer scientists, sometimes they don't know who they are, right, as a profession.
Right. And actually, so you have one thing topic I told you ahead of time I wanted to address, because I know we have some audience questions that we want to address as well. So what those classes teach. So this is something that has been this has been something that's been argued about since late 1950s, at least, is there has been this real divide between the vision of what the field can be and the really great classes, and then many other classes. So what I consider to be the field's strength, and this is not something I made up, this is something that various fascinating thinkers have been saying all along, like Beatrice Paolucci as early as 1959. The strength of the field is that it's this combination of macro and micro, hands-on, it's light and big structural, it's interdisciplinary. It is both life skills and job skills, and looking at the way the world works. It's learning how to make your life better on an individual level and looking at how society needs to change. So I wrote about an amazing teacher in Virginia, Angela DeHart, who when she taught for instance the life cycle of a cotton t-shirt, so along with sewing on buttons. So kids learned about the global fashion industry and all of the environmental problems and ways to change that, and how it is that you can buy pants in Walmart for $8, and then you really want to know how to sew the button back on because you understand what went into those pants. But at the same time, I mean, when the first time I met you, we were at the 2018 American Association of Family and Consumer Sciences conference, you said about people in the field who had not trained in the field, you said, I will haunt them to their grave if I see a canned biscuit. Because there are all these classes that what do they teach? They're here, take this can of biscuits, pop it open, and you can make cheese twists by sprinkling some shredded mozzarella on them. So my question is what is it going to take to get the class to where it could be? Because I think it's so valuable when it is it's still pretty valuable if you're just learning how to sew on a button, or just learning how to be a professional chef, but
Mhm.
it's so much more powerful when it's doing all of the things at once.
Mhm. And I do think it's so multifactual of how sometimes we miss the mark. I think part of it has to do, we have some great national standards
Mhm.
that then the states go in and write their state standards,
Mhm.
supposedly based on the national standards. We have great standards for family and consumer sciences teacher education that then universities are, or state departments of education are supposed to use those standards and say, this is what it takes to be this kind of teacher. But sometimes there's a disconnect.
Mhm.
Some states who are responsible for writing curriculum or for developing standards or making sure those standards are carried out may in fact not be from education, not from family consumer sciences, may just not even understand what family consumer sciences is, but they're writing standards for
Right.
the state. In fact, I had somebody the other day say something about clothing, textiles, and fashion design. There are no standards. I said, yes, there are. I just had to come up with the standards because there are no national standards. I said, there are national standards in family and consumer sciences. And it was a big shock to
Mhm.
this person.
Yeah.
And so I do think many times we've run into the, and I think sometimes it is gendered. It's a little bit of that, well, we all know this because it's common sense. I am a former principal now in a supervisory role, making these decisions
Mm.
and assuming I know it
Right.
because I eat, I have children, I wear clothes, you know. So I think that's part of the problem is there's been a disconnect. Another problem that Janine Duncan from K-State and I are finding is a lot of research in family and consumer sciences back in the day at universities. We had people dedicated to home economics research.
Mm.
We now have so few of us, and many of us are teaching many classes and not doing much research because
Right.
it isn't within our, it's not within our expectations, or there's just not time.
Right.
And so not having that research to be able to push out to talk about, you know, when we talk about, you know, the difference between us and perhaps a health teacher might be, and a family and consumer science teacher is not only going to talk about perhaps waiting to have children, what happens when you do have children to you, to your family, to your potential family, what are the pros and cons? If you're sexually active in high school, how do you protect yourself? Yes, but what are other implications of being sexually active, and what are the true costs of perhaps having a child early, or being in a relationship with somebody that may actually weigh you down, or that is a hostile relationship. You know, it's very much bigger picture than, you know, here are, you know, here's body parts and here's what STDs look like, and don't do it. You know, it's
Right.
it's more of a multifactual. It's bigger, as you were saying, bigger than just the person.
Yeah.
And I think that's the key to family and consumer sciences. You know, we're synergistic, interdisciplinary, and I think a lot of people don't understand that.
Yeah. 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 Well, should we turn to some of the, I haven't actually looked at the chat to see if there are questions. I just versus comments, but we only have like a few minutes left. So